Today with Jacob Morgan, who is the author of Lead with Vulnerability. And Jacob, you and I were just chatting about what it's like to have a book whose title is often misinterpreted. Radical Candor is often misunderstood as an excuse to act like a jerk. So, Jacob, talk to me about Lead with Vulnerability and what you really intended by this title and how sometimes people misinterpret it.
Yeah, I also struggled with the book title. I wish I could remember what some of the other titles were. But it was a challenge because the whole idea of, and by the way, before we even get into that, the whole message of the book is don't be vulnerable at work.
Yes, which is surprising.
Yes, which sounds a little counterintuitive to the title, which is leading with vulnerability.
Yes.
But the way that we can think about it is vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have. It can be a gap in intelligence, competence, wisdom, experience, whatever it might be. Leading with vulnerability is about exposing that gap that you have, but then demonstrating what you're trying to do to close the gap.
Yeah.
And in the context of work, this makes a big difference because you have customers, you have employees, leaders, projects, deadlines, and you're being paid a salary. And so simply just expressing your discomfort, talking about your challenges, sharing all the areas where you're struggling, that's not necessarily a good thing when you have so many people looking to you
to
do
solve
a
that.
job.
Yeah.
To do a job that you're being paid to do. So that's really what the idea of leading with vulnerability is about. How do you bring together competence and connection, leadership and vulnerability?
Yeah. It's sort of like my son's baseball coach. When one day I was watching baseball practice, and they were doing a drill where they had to run and touch all the bases, run the bases. And one kid kept missing the base as he was running around. And the coach was really sort of making it very clear to him that he had not hit the base. And the kid got up, little tears. They were young at this point. And the coach said to him, "Look, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong.
Yep.
And it's my job to tell you what you're doing wrong. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm trying to help you be a better player." And I think a lot of times the vulnerability is the willingness to acknowledge that you didn't hit the base and then to talk about what you're doing to make sure you hit the base next time. Because you're right. We can't do right if we don't know what we're doing wrong.
Yeah. I mean, a very classic example is when you talk about a mistake. It's one thing to show up to work and admit to your boss, "Hey, I made a mistake. I'm really sorry." It's another thing to say, "I made a mistake. Here's what I learned from that mistake. And here's what I'm going to do in the future to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again."
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do a better job of doing. Vulnerability is okay, but bring the leadership to the vulnerability.
Yes. It seems to me like to a certain extent, what you're writing is about is making sure as a leader that you don't go into denial. Richard Tedlow wrote a really interesting book called Denial about how frequently leaders, when they make a mistake or when they don't know how to solve a problem, go into denial about it. Why do leaders why is denial such a problem for leaders?
Well, it's funny. So I interviewed 100 CEOs for this book, and pretty much all of them said that growing up, and not growing up when they were younger, but growing up kind of in the business world, they were all told when they worked for companies, when they went to get their MBAs, leaders do not apologize, leaders do not admit to mistakes, leaders do not show emotion. Some of these people worked with people like Jack Welch, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of like
the man who broke capitalism.
Yeah. I interviewed him on my podcast too. And Jack Welch was a very authentic leader. Like you knew his emotions. He didn't hide anything, but he was not a very vulnerable leader.
Yeah.
And so it's not that I think a lot of leaders today are bad, but that's just how they were taught. That's just what they experienced. And, it's not the right way to lead, but at the time that was acceptable. That was the standard. I don't know if you remember, I think it was Fortune magazine. They used to publish an annual America's Toughest Bosses. And I think it was in the 80s, the 90s, maybe even in the 70s. And it was a badge of honor to be on the cover of that magazine. And it was a badge of honor to work for one of those types of leaders. And they would share all sorts of crazy stories. This boss is so tough. And, you work for him and he does this. And, and it was like, I can't imagine something like that happening today.
Yeah.
Which is wild. But a lot of leaders do it because that's what they were taught. The vulnerability is scary, it's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant. And the number one thing when we ask 14,000 employees, why aren't you vulnerable at work? Is they say, we don't want to be perceived as being weak or incompetent.
Yeah.
So we associate vulnerability with incompetence.
Yeah.
And the
Or
way that you,
weakness.
yeah, and the way that you get over that is you add competence to the vulnerability.
Yeah.
I made a mistake, but here's what I learned. I need help, but here's what I'm going to do to solve my problem in the future.
Yeah.
Like a very classic example is if you're a first-time leader. And oftentimes new leaders, they talk to their employees and they say, hey, I'm new here. I'm really nervous. I've never done this before, but we're going to do a great job. Like, go team.
Yeah.
Vulnerable,
Yeah.
bad message.
Yeah.
Adding the leadership piece. I'm a first-time leader. I've never done this before. I'm super nervous. But to help make sure I'm the best leader you've ever had, I'm getting coaching and mentoring from Sally, who works in marketing. I have an executive coach. Here are 3 books that I'm reading. And my door's always open for your feedback. Vulnerable, added the leadership piece. It's a different way, right? It's you get perceived differently.
Yeah. What is your favorite story of a strong leader who expressed their strength through vulnerability? You interviewed so many great leaders. You have so many great stories in this book. You don't have to say what's one you want to tell us now? I'm not going to make you pick favorites.
There's a few. I can give you like a bad story of what happened to a leader, and then I can give you kind of a positive one.
Let's do that.
Yeah. So this CEO that I interviewed, after she told me this story and I put it in the book, she then told me she didn't want to be identified.
Okay.
So I changed her name, but she's the CEO of a large telecommunications company in Europe. So I'll leave it at that. And she told me this story where early on in her career, she wasn't the CEO at the time. She was an executive working for a different organization, also a large company.
Mm-hmm.
And she was working for another a lady, a CEO at the time, and she was vulnerable with the CEO, and she's like, I don't have a lot of confidence. I didn't come up through the ranks in the kind of the traditional educational background. I didn't go to college, and this was over time, not like one session. She just unburdened herself. But she was comfortable sharing who she was and what she cared about and what she valued and about her family with her CEO at the time. And over time, she would notice just like weird things happening. So one day she went on vacation and she came back from vacation and she noticed that her office used to be next door to the CEO, and all of a sudden it got moved 3 doors down.
Weird. While she was on vacation.
Yep, while she was on vacation. She would notice that employees on her team, like her high performers, would all of a sudden get moved to other teams without her being notified.
Oh my gosh.
She would be in meetings and the CEO would kind of poke jabs at her and make fun of her for certain things that she was doing. Finally, their CEO said, you know what, we need to hire you an executive coach because you're struggling in these areas. And she's like, okay, fine. So she gets this executive coach and she finds out later that this executive coach is reporting everything that she's sharing with her back to the CEO.
Oh my gosh. What kind of executive coach does that? Like
it was like a spy novel. Yeah. It's crazy. And finally the CEO's like, look, we got to put you on a performance improvement plan. You're not doing a good job here. And this lady's like, I'm done. Like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And I asked her afterwards, I said, you were vulnerable with the CEO and she clearly used what you shared with her against you.
Yeah.
Are you ever going to be vulnerable with anybody else ever again? And she's like, absolutely. And I said, how could you say that? You were vulnerable. This woman tried to destroy your career and end you. Why would you ever be vulnerable with anybody else? And she said, because what it did is it taught me that I need to do a better job of being vulnerable and leading with vulnerability with people that are looking out for me.
Yeah.
With organizations that align to my values and have my best interest at heart.
Yes.
And she said that what she did after that situation is she really just took a step back and said, what did I learn about myself? What did I learn about the other person, the company, the culture, and how can I apply these things going forward to make sure that I have better experiences? Yeah. And I thought that was a really powerful and important lesson that she shared. So that's kind of a bad story.
Yeah, so I think that's before we go to the good story, let's double click on the bad story because I think you said a bunch of things that were really important. One is that just because someone took advantage of your vulnerability doesn't mean that you never should be vulnerable again,
Yeah.
because vulnerability is essential to forming good relationships.
Yep.
And if someone shows you that you can't have a good relationship with them because they take advantage of your vulnerability, that's a shame, but shame on them, not shame on you for showing your vulnerability.
Yes.
You can't. Lindy West talks about this in her writing. In one of my favorite books, Shrill, is you've got to, even though sometimes people will take advantage of your vulnerability, if you want to become the person you want to be and you want to have the relationships that you want to have, you've got to continue to allow yourself to be vulnerable, but not once you recognize that someone is going to take advantage of your vulnerability, stop
Yes.
it.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the one promise that I can make to anybody listening and watching is that at some point in your life, vulnerability will be
Be
used against
used
you.
against you. Yeah.
But the good news is it's not going to happen nearly as often as you think. It will happen, but it's not going to happen all the time.
Yeah.
And this is why. So one of the things that I talk about in the book are these 8 attributes of vulnerable leaders, and one of them is self-compassion.
Yeah.
And self-compassion is basically this idea of how you talk to yourself, giving yourself a safe place to land, so to speak. And the reason why this is important is because if you don't have self-compassion, then in these situations that go against you, you're going to beat yourself up to the point where you're going to say, you're such an idiot. You're such a moron. How could you do this? I'm never going to be vulnerable again.
Yeah.
If you have self-compassion, you're going to say, hey, you know what? It's okay. You can, take what you've learned, apply it somewhere else. Don't beat yourself up. Life goes on. You're going to be okay. And it gives you that kind of safety net so that you can be vulnerable again in the future.
Yeah.
And, I interviewed a psychologist named Sim Sitkin. He's at the Duquois School of Business. And he said that in academic literature, there are 22 different definitions of trust. And every single one of them have to do with vulnerability.
Yeah.
Meaning that you cannot have trust without vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't have a relationship without
Exactly. And there is a right and a wrong way to approach vulnerability. And you just kind of alluded to it. And that is that if you don't know who I have this framework, it's called the vulnerability wheel, and there are 5 components in there. And I won't go through all of them, but kind of at the center of this is intention. So why are you being vulnerable? If you don't know the why, don't do it. Simple as that. But one of the other elements of that wheel are, who are you being vulnerable with? If you're being vulnerable with somebody who you don't know if they have your best intentions in mind, maybe they're out to get you. If you don't know that, or if you kind of get a bad sense from them, don't be vulnerable with them.
Yeah.
And too often we don't think through these different elements of why, who, the situation, we just kind of blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't go well.
So I think I sort of feel like, and this may be like a function of privilege, but I feel like for me, I feel pretty safe being vulnerable with, I mean, as soon as someone demonstrates to me that that they're going to take advantage of it, then I'll shut it down. But it's pretty easy for me to be vulnerable with a wide variety of people. But that may not be and that's like how privilege compounds, right? So the fact that it's safe for me to take risks with a wide variety of people means that it's easier for me to build relationships with a wide variety of people. Whereas a bunch of people who I talked to, especially as I was writing Radical Respect, said they have to assume that it's not safe for them to be vulnerable. So how do we break through this this situation where there's such an advantage to assuming good intent, but a lot of people have a lot of data that shows that it's not safe for them to assume good intent?
Well, I don't think you should ever assume anything. I mean, I don't feel safe a lot of times to be vulnerable because I'm very uncomfortable with vulnerability. I went pretty much my entire adult working life not being vulnerable because that's what I was taught. I was raised by 2 immigrant parents who came from the former USSR. And growing up, my dad always said, don't show emotion. Don't talk about your feelings. Nobody cares about your problems.
And it wasn't safe in the USSR.
No, no. And vulnerability for me is super uncomfortable. Even with friends and family, like I do not like vulnerability. And it's funny because I interviewed some CEOs who are more comfortable with vulnerability and others who are not. And so many different reasons why you might be comfortable, why you might not, where you're raised, how you grew up, your experiences. I mean, the list can go on and on and on for why people are more comfortable with it and why they're not. But I don't think you can ever assume, but you can't assume anything about anything. So for example, when you ask for a promotion, when you ask for a raise, if you ask somebody out on a date for the first time, you can never make assumptions. It's one of those things where you have to do it
And see what
and
happens.
see what happens.
Yeah.
But there are smart ways that you can do it. There are good ways that you can approach it. So for example, you're not just going to go up to somebody you don't know inside your company and like, oh, my family this, and I have my dad this. Like, yeah, it's not smart.
Yeah.
But paying attention to your intention, like what's the goal? Like, I have something that I want to share with this person. Why do I want to share this? What is the outcome that I'm hoping to achieve? Who's the person that I'm sharing it with? They have my best intentions in mind. The timing, is now a good time to be sharing this vulnerability? Like what's going on in my life, the person's life, the business, where, like, are we sitting in some sort of a crowded bar, or are we in an office where we can have that conversation? Professionalism makes a big difference. So for example, if you go to a doctor and you don't want your doctor to look at you and say, oh my God, I've never seen this before. And they're like crying and freaking out and they're being so vulnerable. I don't know. Oh my God. They're like, get in here. You guys got to see that. Like, you don't want that.
Yeah.
You want
Although
the doctor.
I have seen a time when a doctor didn't know and they pulled out a book to look it up. And I was like, I'm glad they're pulling it. Like, I'm glad they're looking it up, but I wasn't like, what do you think about that as a doctor showing?
Oh man, I would feel weird if I was in a doctor's office and the doctor's like, hang on a second, I got to look this up. I'd be like, whoa. I need a second and a third opinion after talking to you.
Yeah.
So I mean, but the professionalism there matters. Like, even though the doctor comes in there and they see something terrible, they're going to be professional. Similarly, if you're a leader inside of an organization and let's say an employee is giving a talk for the first time, you as a leader are not going to say, who the hell hired you? That was the worst thing I've ever heard. Who let you into the building? Get out of here. That's not professional.
Yeah.
Right. So professionalism also makes a difference. So that's the wheel basically that I walk people through. So walk through those 5 things. The intention, who am I being vulnerable with? Where am I being vulnerable? The timing, the professionalism, all that stuff matters. And if you can walk through that wheel and you kind of check all those things off, I have the intention. Now's the good time. Yes, I can be professional. Yes, this person has my best interest in mind. Yes, now is the right timing. Go for it.
Yeah.
And then if it doesn't go your way, that's where the self-compassion comes into play. But you're never going to predict. You're never going to know what the outcome is. But that's why vulnerability is vulnerability, because it makes you uncomfortable and it's weird and it's, it makes everybody feel, unpleasant.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to your story, the story of vulnerability not working out. I think that this leader that you were describing had she didn't know for sure whether her boss had her best, had her back, but it should have been the case that her boss had her back. So it wasn't unreasonable to make herself a little bit vulnerable with this leader. I mean, once she learned that that her boss did not have her back, then shut down the ball. But how do you know when someone has your back, or has your best interest at heart and doesn't? And I would argue that one of the best ways to know is to try and to pay attention to the response. But that's taking a risk with your vulnerability.
Risk is a part of it. There's no way to eliminate risk from the equation, but you can kind of tell by people's behavior and their actions.
Yeah.
So, in a work context, is this the type of person who, when you need help, they come to help you?
Yeah.
Is it the type of person where in a meeting, if you make a mistake, they defend you?
Yeah.
Is this the type of person when you're not around, they're speaking highly of you?
Yeah.
This is the type of person that wants to spend time with you at work or outside of work. I mean, you can kind of tell.
You get a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you can get a sense. And this is kind of being part of being a human.
Yeah.
And this is kind of on a side note. This is why I think it's so dangerous for, I think, a lot of younger people to be stuck on phones and glued on their computer
Yes.
screens, because when you do that, you lose this ability.
To get a sense of whether
Yeah,
people.
you kind of eliminate this part of your brain that is a kind of a human indicator. If the only way that you're able to interact and engage is through a screen and through a phone and through
Yeah.
right, a whole
You're
side
not.
point.
Yeah.
But
That's
yeah, so
I
we're really
agree.
good as human beings of internally just inherently possessing that. And you can kind of
Mhm.
get a sense when somebody has your best interest in mind and when they don't. And you also get a pretty good sense of like, I don't know about that person. And if
Yeah.
you get one of those, like, I don't know,
Pay
chances
attention to
are,
it.
and
Yeah.
maybe they can prove themselves and maybe they do have your best interest in mind. But if you don't know,
Yeah.
you know,
Proceed with caution.
go slow, right?
Yeah.
You can, go slowly and proceed with things before you just jump kind of into the big things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's good advice. All right. So let's talk about the good story. When vulnerability working out. Good leadership with vulnerability.
Yes. So this was a story from Fleetwood Grobler. He's the former CEO of Sasol. I think he might actually be the chairman now in a South African energy company. I think they have around
Mhm.
35,000 employees. He was put into a CEO role during the pandemic. He was never CEO before. He wasn't really sure what he was doing. And the company was $13 billion in debt, and the banks were about to come in and repossess the business.
Wow.
And his executive board is like, hey, you're the CEO
Good luck.
now. Yeah, you're the CEO. Do an all hands meeting, introduce yourself, and hopefully you can get this stuff sorted. And so he went in front of his entire company and he gave a message where he started off with vulnerability. And he's like, look,
Mhm.
I know the company's going through a tough time and I know the cards are stacked against us. And
Mhm.
I don't even know exactly what we're going to do to get out of this mess.
Yeah.
But I do know that we have a really talented group of people. And I know that if we come together, we can rebuild trust in the eyes of our customers and in our employees.
Mhm.
And if you come with me on this journey, and if you help me figure out different ideas and solutions, that I know that we can turn around this business. And that's exactly what the company did. So he was
Wow.
vulnerable, but he also added that leadership piece in there. Now, of
Yeah.
course, he gave a much longer speech and then there were actions behind it and this and that. But that was kind of the gist of the idea is like, I
Yeah.
know we're struggling, but I know we can turn things around with your help. And here's how we can do it.
Yeah.
And I always contrast this with a story from Hollis Harris, who used to be the former CEO of Continental Airlines. He passed away a few years ago.
Yeah,
And
I was just thinking about this story and was gonna ask you.
yeah, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s. The airline was going through a tough time. And he had a similar situation where his board was like, okay, you got to, send out a memo to the entire company. And his memo also talks about the challenges and the struggles and this and that. And then he ends his memo by saying the best thing that you can do is pray for the future of the company. And, the next day he was fired.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a message that's purely based on vulnerability. There was no leadership. There was no action. There was no anything.
Mhm.
And too often, I think leaders get stuck in that space. So add the leadership to the vulnerability when you can.
Yeah, there's another airline story. I forgot which airline or which leader. This is the one I was thinking of, where they were, 6 days away from bankruptcy, like imminent bankruptcy. And he walked into his team and he said, "We're 6 days away from bankruptcy. I don't know what to do. You all figure it out." And then he walked out of the room. So,
You have to look this
what's
one up.
so what is that about? And in the end, the team did figure it out. So it was, and it may be an extreme version of we have the right people around the table. We can figure this out. Well, you all can figure this out. But he sort of took an extreme view, which is, I don't have the answers. You have the answers, and he literally walked out of the room. I would say it's better to stay in the room and help them figure it out. But maybe I don't know. I don't know why he decided the right right thing to
Yeah,
do
I
was
would
to.
love to know. Yeah, I was trying to like
I'll
look
dig
up.
it up. Yeah, you're not gonna find it. I know who know. I'll get you the story.
Yeah, but I also don't think that's a good message. I think that was just pure luck.
Yes.
That
Well, and
happened.
and and it was abdication, really, of
Yeah, that's
responsibility.
also not good because I mean, as a leader, you don't just we have a problem, go figure it out.
Yeah.
Leave me
I
out of
don't know
it.
what to do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's also not leadership, and that's not vulnerability. That's just
Abdication.
yeah, that's not very effective, I think, in any regard. But To your point, you said they figured it out. So I'm sure now he's looking back and he's saying, yeah, you know, I
He's
just
saying,
trusted my
"Yeah, what a
team and
yeah,
I knew they
yeah,
were going to figure something out and this and that. But
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
that's not an
yeah,
effective approach.
yeah." No, I agree. Not as a general rule. Um, so, uh, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about figuring out who you can trust and who you can't trust is something my daughter told me when she was in 3rd grade. And she was getting bullied, at
Mm.
school, and as kids often are, and I was encouraging her to show vulnerability. It was stupid in retrospect. I was like, "Tell this child I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah." And she banged her fist on the table and she said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?" I think that was wisdom from her. But why do we do that so often? When someone is clearly bullying someone else, and then we encourage that person to say how they're feeling, like, that is not a good way to demonstrate that's I think that's what you mean when you say, "Don't be vulnerable at work." Like, why do we give people that advice so often?
Yeah, it's funny. My daughter goes through similar situations as well, and
I'm sorry. It's hard to watch
yeah,
it.
yeah, and sometimes it's with friends, right? And
Yeah.
she has friends, but you know, my daughter, she's very sensitive. She's turning 8 years old. She'll let it affect her, and you know, she might cry, she might get very upset, but she will never say anything. And so, one of the things that
Yeah.
we've been working on is I say, look, if you have a friend that does that to you, um, you can assertively say, "Hey, I don't like that you did that." Like she has a friend, for example, where when they get in a little argument, her friend will say, "Our friendship is dead."
Yeah.
And she'll say like these dramatic things, and it really upsets my daughter because
Yeah.
they're good friends, they're best friends. And so I told my daughter, I said, "Look, next time that happens, you know, there are a
Mhm.
couple things that you can do. One is just say, is our friendship really dead? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Ask a question. Yeah.
yeah." And so that's one thing. And the second thing I tell her is you can confront her and say, you know, that I don't appreciate that you're saying that.
Yeah.
Or maybe she'll do something. She'll like her friend will hit her or something. I'll say, Naomi, you can tell her that that's not okay. And friends don't
Yeah.
hit friends.
Yeah.
And tell her that that upset you and ask the other person to apologize. In other words, you take that kind of that power back and you say, okay, you did this to me. You apologize.
Yeah, yeah, and I
And
think that's the point, like, that you apologize, "You did this to me,"
yeah,
you, uh, is really important in those not like, "I feel sad," but "You can't talk to me like that," or
yeah, exactly. Like that's not okay, this and that. And you kind of but it's been working very well for her and her friend. And I
good.
talked to her friend about it, and they're getting really good at apologizing to each other and not, you know, saying these dramatic statements like our
Yeah.
friendship you know, when you're 6 and 7 and 8 years old, a
Yeah,
little
that
thing
it feels like the end of the
yeah,
world.
everything is over. But yeah, in the context of work, we're always taught to kind of shield that.
Mhm,
And it's funny, like even in with friends, like we've had
mhm.
friends in the past where we would hang out with them and they would always be on their phone,
Yeah,
non-stop.
yeah.
To the point where like you would have a
What's the point of
conversation.
getting together?
Yeah. And finally, you know, my wife made a comment to one of them and she's like, hey, you know, get up, like you're at our house, we're having dinner together, get off your phone.
Yeah,
And this other lady made a snarky comment. She's like, I'm not your child. Long story short, we're not friends anymore.
yeah,
But you know what? Then that's okay,
yeah,
right? If you
yeah,
can't be with someone and give them the gift of your attention and not stare at your screen in front of your phone, I don't
yeah.
want to be friends with you.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
there's
okay.
no it's a waste of time, right?
It
Like,
is.
if we're
It
gonna
is.
get together, then let's be together.
Yeah. So I think it's okay to speak up,
Mhm.
and not like, oh, you know, you hurt me or no, this and that. But it's okay to speak up and say, look, I don't know if anybody's ever told you this, but when you come to somebody else's house and if you're just on your phone all the time, you know, it doesn't make us feel great because we're having you over for dinner. We're putting time and effort. We're cooking, we're
Yeah,
cleaning. We'd love to be able to have a conversation with you. And we can't do that if you're on your phone.
yeah,
If the other person's going to freak out and get upset by that, it's all good. We're probably
yeah,
just not meant to be friends.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
you're wasting my time,
yeah. So how you deliver that message is important. So same
yeah,
thing at work and same thing if you're a child.
yeah,
Um, you deliver it in a professional way. So if somebody's
mhm,
putting you down at work, if somebody's doing what, you know, whatever it might be for you, it's okay to go to them and say, hey, you know, we were in that meeting and I've got to be honest with you, I really didn't like the way that you talked to me. I don't know
yeah,
if you realize that, and maybe it wasn't intentional, but you kind of threw me under the bus in front of our entire team. That's
yeah,
not cool. And I just
Yeah.
wanted you to know. Um, and from there, you can tell the other person might say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that."
Yeah.
Or
They
they're going
get
to say,
defensive. Yeah.
"I didn't do that," or you had it coming.
Yeah.
And at that point, you know that that is not someone that you need to be near.
Yeah, 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 and I think it's really important to be able to slice and dice,
Yeah,
to
for sure.
know, like, and and I think sometimes part of the reason that we don't confront people who respond badly when we make ourselves vulnerable is that we're afraid that the net result is that we're not gonna be able to be close to them, but you're not gonna be so I think just being realistic about it is important.
Yeah,
So
but I think and confronting, I think, is actually very effective, and not confronting in a like I'm gonna beat you up like angry kind
yeah,
of way, but
yeah.
just letting the other person know.
That
Like
the impact of their behavior.
yeah, yeah, and sometimes you can even do it in a joking way. Like I have another friend who's frequently on his phone. Like he's working on it and getting better, but whenever he pulls out his phone when we're talking, I'll mess with him a little bit,
Yeah,
and I'll say, "What are you doing? Are you texting me over there? What are you doing?"
yeah,
Like I'll
yeah,
play around with it or so you can do it in a very direct and confrontational way, or you can kind of just use humor and use
yeah.
other techniques to just let the other person know, and they'll be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just distracted." I'm like, "Okay, it's okay."
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So somebody just wrote, "When you did X, it made me feel Y. I'm asking you don't do Z in the future." And I think that can work when the person is unaware of what
Yeah,
they did wrong. However, there are as my daughter was that's what I was sort of encouraging my daughter. When you knocked my sandwich on the floor, it made me feel sad. And she was like, "The reason why they knocked my sandwich on the floor is because they wanted to make me feel sad." And so in that case, I think that formula doesn't work as well. You need you need you did this to me.
yeah,
And it had this impact and here's the consequences. You need to make the other person aware that their behavior has bad consequences for them because they don't care how you feel.
yeah,
you
and it
know.
also depends on if this is somebody that you care about, if so this is somebody that you want to have in your friendship circle, and if this is
Mhm.
somebody that you want to spend time with. I mean,
Yeah.
there have been lots of situations where I've had unpleasant encounters, as I'm sure you have, and so has everybody else, where you're just kind of like, this isn't worth my time. I'm not going
Yeah.
to talk to you again. I'm not going to invite you over again. Like, we're good. I don't need to make
Yeah.
a thing out of it because I'm deleting
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
also okay.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. So can we talk about following with vulnerability? I think there's so much written about leadership, but I think being a strong follower is just as important part of a career as being a strong leader.
Yeah.
So how can we follow with vulnerability? Like how can we make sure that if let's say for example we have a boss. I have a boss and my boss is bullying me. Like how can I respond or maybe not bullying me, but my boss is tends to yell at me and just tends to yell, period. And maybe my boss is not even aware. I don't know. Like, why is my boss yelling all the time? Like, how do I follow with vulnerability in that kind of situation?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because I'm working on this with my kids as well. And sometimes I'll like I have a 4 year old, my 4 year old son, and he still talks in his very little tiny baby voice. And sometimes I'll do things that annoy him or upset him, or maybe emotionally hurt him by saying something. And sometimes
Yeah.
he'll literally walk like if you've seen those memes where
Yeah.
the guy's like walking with his head down and he
Oh.
like he literally walks like that and goes and I like it's heartbreaking. But I always have to tell him, I say, Noah, what did I do?
Yeah.
And he'll say, "Nee, nee, 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 nee." I'll say, no, no, no. Look at me and speak up and tell me what I did to upset you.
Yeah.
And so he's getting much better now when I do something to say, Daddy, I didn't like that you did that. Please stop. I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa. All
Yeah.
right.
That's good.
Like,
He's yeah.
where'd that come from? Um, so I mean, that's kind of on the parenting side. In a work context, I think you can apply some similar things there.
Mhm.
Um, you can also let people know how you want to be treated. I mean, if somebody's
Yeah.
screaming and yelling at you,
Yeah.
it is vulnerable to go to that leader and say, "Hey, I just got to be honest with you. You're screaming and yelling at me a lot, and it doesn't feel great. Like, is there maybe a different way that you can give me that feedback? Because when you're yelling at me, I just don't hear anything and I just get upset.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
I
I want
can't,
to, I want to do a good
yeah.
job.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to do a good job and I want to be a member of this team, but I can't absorb the information when you're screaming it at me. So can you
Yeah.
just talk to me in a normal way? And I think from that regard, so kind of what I like about that approach is you're not just confronting the other person and telling them what they're doing, but you're also letting them know how it's impacting your ability to do the work that you need to do for
Yeah.
them.
Yes.
So it's not just, hey, you're yelling at me and that upsets me.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually keeping me from doing the work that you're asking me to do. And I'm trying to do a good job for you.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think if you can bring that piece into it, then it feels, because nobody wants to feel like they're attacked. Nobody wants to feel like they're being criticized or
Yeah.
critiqued.
Yeah.
And leaders especially get very, very sensitive in that regard.
Yeah.
So if you can make it put in some of that angle about the work, I think that's very helpful. And that'll allow the leader to say, oh, wow, yeah, well, I do want you to do a good job.
Yeah.
This project is important. Maybe I should change, as opposed to there's something wrong with me as a leader, as a person.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't go to my boss who's yelling at me and say, "You're a bully." I say, when you yell, I literally cannot hear what you're saying,
Yeah,
and I want to hear what you're saying, but I just can't. I can't absorb information
yeah,
that's delivered this way.
exactly.
So Jim Wilson, who by the way listened to your book and loved it, says he really loves the point that if the other person does not respond with the same vulnerability, then maybe you don't want to be around them. If you think they can come around, it may be worth some effort to continue, but until then, it's not. So I think that that's a really good point. You want to have the expectation that your vulnerability is matched with some of their vulnerability, that they also respond in kind.
Yeah, and I also believe in second chances. Second chances. There's this concept in psychology called fundamental attribution error, which
Yes,
basically states, and I'm sure familiar with it.
but
And
explain it to folks who may not be familiar with it.
yeah, it's this idea that oftentimes when things don't go the right way, we attribute why things don't go the right way to the person's behavior and attitude and who they are, as opposed to the situation.
Yeah,
So, for example, you go to a restaurant and you have a waiter who's maybe a little bit rude. Maybe they spilled water on you and they have some attitude, and you're just kind of like, wow, that person's such a jerk. I'm going to get them
yeah,
fired. What are they doing
yeah,
working here? And so you assume that that person is just flawed as a human being, and that's just their character, and you want to get them.
yeah.
But
It's like
rarely
a
do it.
fundamental personality attribute that they have that causes
Exactly.
them to, it's a judgment. It's a
Yeah.
very
But
fixed mindset judgment.
yep. But rarely ever do we take a step back and say, maybe that person just got yelled at by their boss.
Yeah,
Maybe their boyfriend or girlfriend left them. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they have a sick relative.
yeah,
Like, we never think about the situation. Similarly,
yeah,
like if you're in traffic or you're driving and somebody cuts you off,
yeah,
you just think, oh, that person's such a jerk, blah, blah, blah. You
yeah.
don't think, oh, maybe that person's on the way to the hospital. They have an emergency.
Right,
And
right.
what a lot of the research shows is that most of the time, how a person behaves and acts is a result of the situation, not as a result of who the person is as a human being.
Yeah,
And this is important when we think about vulnerability, because oftentimes if something doesn't go your way, vulnerability gets used against you. It very well could be that it's the situation, that
yeah,
that person is scared, that that
yeah,
person is being beaten down by their boss.
yeah,
And so I am a big believer in second and sometimes even third chances, depending on what the circumstance and situation is. But that comes down to a personal choice. Is this somebody that I want to build a relationship with, that I want in my life, either personally or professionally?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And is it like we all have a finite amount of time and energy? And is this relationship at this moment something that I want to make the investment in? And often it's not like I'm condemning that other person, but I have these other people in my life who it's more important for me to invest in. I often uh, have thought that if I answered every email that I got, that I would neglect my children. And so it's more important for me to not neglect my children and miss some emails,
Yep.
And it's a hard trade-off because sometimes I miss emails from people I really care about and I really like, and I piss them off. But it's got to be okay. I think it's so important. The fundamental attribution error is so important because to recognize, because it does sort of it's so satisfying for some reason to condemn another person as evil and
It
to say
is.
that's the problem, is that person is evil. And I'm not saying there aren't evil people in the world. There are, but that is rarely the problem. The problem is often that person is in a situation, or even that person is in a system that causes them to behave badly. And so what can we do to change the system so that the person doesn't have all these incentives to behave badly?
Well, there are probably a few things that you can do. I mean, leading by example is always a big one.
Yeah.
So, be the leader that you wish you had and that your organization and that your team needs. Like, you don't need anybody's permission to lead with vulnerability. You don't need anybody's permission to be empathetic. You don't need anybody's permission to be competent. You don't need anybody's permission to do any of these things.
Yeah.
And so you can be the type of leader that ultimately that you need and want to be.
Yeah.
But I mean, the truth is that there are always going to be some corporate cultures which are not great and some corporate cultures which are great. And you need to decide on the trade-offs that you want for yourself. So for example, if you go work for Elon Musk at one of his companies, you can probably be assured that you're going to work crazy hours. You'll be paid well. You're going to work on some really complex problems and challenges. But is there going to be a lot of conversation there about like empathy or well-being or emotional intelligence or some of those things? Probably not. I mean, maybe, but you know that Elon Musk is very much a different type of leader.
Yeah.
If you go work at a company like Microsoft, where you have Satya Nadella as the CEO, yeah, I mean, you know that in that kind of environment, you're going to have a little bit more balance, a little bit more conversations about well-being and emotional intelligence and fixed first growth mindset. It's a different environment. You might not work on as big, complex problems and challenges. You might not be doing some of the crazy, cool stuff that Elon is doing, but everything in life is a trade-off. Everything in life
or
is a
you might
choice.
be working on even cooler stuff.
Yeah,
You never
you
know.
might be. Yeah,
I
you might be.
And I think the important thing when you're looking at companies is not only to look at the leaders of those companies, but also to look at their management systems. And
Yeah.
because great leaders design great management systems that include checks and balances at every stage of the employee life cycle, and that look for biased results at every
Yeah.
stage of the employee life cycle. And when you can find not only great leaders, but leaders who have developed great management systems that are designed to have fair and reasonable outcomes, then you're less likely to have the worst kinds of behavior, what I call in radical respect, the brutal incompetence, which
Yeah.
does happen all too often.
Yeah, that's never a good situation. Brutal incompetence. That sounds quite
But
terrible, honestly.
and yet it happens,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It happens. It
all
happens
too
quite a
often.
bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So we need to be able to have open conversations, open debate. We need to be able to talk about these types of things inside of organizations, and that's where this theme of psychological safety comes into play.
yeah,
So if you're part of a team or an organization where you don't have that psychological safety, chances are it's probably not a good team for you to be a part of. And similarly, as a leader, part of your job is to create that psychological safety.
yeah.
What's really interesting about that, and there was some recent research that came out from Peter Capelli at Wharton, I believe,
Mhm.
where he talked about too much psychological safety, which is also true. And his argument was that, you just need to create some psychological safety. You don't need to go crazy with it, because his argument was that if you create a place where anybody can say anything and there's no such thing as a bad idea, then what tends to happen is that people take advantage, performance goes down, and you kind of get this diminishing rate of return. So as a leader, you don't need to create this like overly psychological safe place where, like to the
Yeah, and
extreme.
I think that Amy Edmondson would say that's not what you're describing is not psychological safety. What that
Yes.
is anything goes. And
Yes. Yes.
true psychological safety is about holding people accountable for their mistakes, for saying something that maybe hurt
Yeah.
someone else, but doing it in a way that shows them respect, like core respect, unconditional respect, and that lets them know that this is a place where if you learn from your mistakes, it's safe to make a mistake, but it that doesn't mean not holding someone accountable for their
Yes.
mistakes.
Yes. And that I think is a very, very important thing for a lot of leaders to remember.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's an excellent note to end on. So, vulnerability is important, but often misunderstood. Psychological safety is important, but often misunderstood, as is radical candor. So, these ideas, it's important for people to wrestle with them. And I think you helped us do that today, Jacob. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Take care, everyone.